Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to create brand new posts by using the REST API. Without further ado, let's jump right into the action. Alright, so if we visit the My Notes page, in our previous lesson we set up edit and delete functionality, and now in this lesson I want to cover the missing piece of the puzzle, which is the ability to create an entirely new note. So maybe right about here, let's add a form that users can fill out to create a brand new note post. So in order to add that form to this page, let's jump into our text editor. And within our theme folder, let's jump into page mynotes.php. And how about right above the unordered list that contains all of our note posts, right above that, but still within the container div, why don't we create a new div, and let's give it a class of create note. Okay, and then within this div, let's add a few different elements. So first, let's add a heading level 2, and it can read create new note. Okay, and then right below this heading, let's also add an input, and right below that, let's add a text area. The input will be the field where they type in the title, and this will be the field where they type in the body content. So with that in mind, on the input, why don't we give it a placeholder of title, and for the text area, give that a placeholder of your note here. Okay, then for CSS or design reasons, why don't we give these elements classes? So on the heading, I will give it a class of headline and headline -- medium. I will give the input a class of new note title, and I will give the text area a class of new note body. Okay, and finally, before we save this, why don't we add a submit button? So right below the text area element, I will create a span, and it will read create note. And for styling reasons, let's give that a class of submit note. Actually, I should mention that these class names are not only for styling purposes. We can also use these class names to target the elements with our JavaScript. Anyways, with this in place, let's go ahead and save. And then back on the front end, that gives us this brand new form. Now at the moment, nothing happens when you click the orange Create Note button. So for the next step, let's write JavaScript so that when you click this button, we send off a request to a REST API URL. So let's go set up that JavaScript. Back in the text editor, let's look within our JS modules folder, and then hop into My Notes.js. And let's begin by setting up a new event that watches for clicks on the new Create Note button. In order to save a bit of typing, I'm just going to copy and duplicate one of these existing event lines. And on this new copy, let's change the selector from update note to submit note, because this is the class of this orange button down here. Okay, and then when that button gets clicked on, what do we want to do in response? Well, instead of running a method named update note, why don't we set up a brand new method named create note? Okay, now let's go set up a new method with this exact matching name, create note. And to save a ton of typing, I'm just going to scroll down and find our update note method, and we can just duplicate this and rename it. So I'm going to select from the beginning of update note all the way down to the end of the method here, copy that into my clipboard, and then right below it, paste it in. Okay, on this new copy, let's change the name from update note to create note. All right, we no longer need this variable because in this case, we don't need a reference to the parent list item of the element that got clicked on. Right? That element in this variable was necessary when we were dealing with multiple posts and multiple copies of the same edit and delete button. But now that we're just dealing with this one single create form, We don't need this variable anymore, so let's delete that line. We can keep this because we still need to construct an object that contains the title and body contents, but we do need to update these two values here. So instead, let's say title equals, and then it should just be the value of whatever they've typed into this field. So let's delete this note.find, and instead we can just use jQuery to select an element that has a class of new note title, and then tack on .val to get the value. And then let's do the same thing for content. The content property should equal whatever someone has typed into this field. So let's delete this and instead use jQuery to select the element that has a class of new note body, and then use .val to get the actual value. Okay, and the name of this variable does not matter, but just so our code makes sense to us, instead of our updated post, why don't we name it our new post? And if we're going to change the name of this variable here, then down in our Ajax request, when we say data equals, we want to be sure to update the reference to it here. So instead of our updated post, let's say our new post. Okay, and perhaps the most important change of all is the URL property of our Ajax request. At the moment, this code is set up to update an existing post. Because if you include an ID at the end of the URL like this, WordPress interprets that as you wanting to only work with that one existing post. So in this case, let's delete this code that would grab the ID, and let's delete the plus symbol as well. And just this in and of itself is all it takes to create a brand new post. Now obviously we want to create a post with the post type of note, but if you wanted to create a blog post, you could say posts. If you wanted to create a page, you could say pages. But we're just going to say note, singular, because that's the short name or variable name for this custom post type. And before we move on, you might be scratching your head and saying, isn't this the REST API URL that would normally fetch the 10 most recent posts? Well, yes, that would be the case if we were sending a GET request. But remember, there are different types of requests. And we're saying the type that we want to send is a POST request, not a GET request. So we are posting or sending data. And WordPress will interpret this as us wanting to create a brand new post. Okay, now before we save this and test it out, let's just take care of one more thing, and that is our success function. So if our request is successful and WordPress actually creates a brand new post, I think it would be cool if we dynamically added it to this list of notes on the fly. So for example, you fill out the title, you fill out the body, and then when you click this button, if the request is successful, I think we should automatically clear out these fields so they get reset back to their empty state. And I think we should slide down the new note post down here. So in order to make that happen, within our success function, we can leave the console.log congrats and response, but let's delete this line where we were making the fields read-only again. That only makes sense in the context of editing an existing note. We don't need it here when we are creating a note. Okay, and let's begin by emptying out these two fields if the creation was successful. So I will use jQuery to select those two fields. New note title, comma, the other one had a class of new note body. Okay, then for both of those elements, we want to target their value and just set it to a completely empty string. Let's include a semicolon at the end of that line. Okay, and then next, let's add a new item to this list of note posts. So remember, each one of the notes is a list item or LI element, and they all live within a container unordered list or UL element. So if we want to add on a new list item to that list, we can just use jQuery, and let's say single quotes, and we can spell out a little bit of HTML that we want to create here. Let's create a list item, and within it, for now, let's just say imagine real data here. We can update this in just a couple of minutes. Okay, but this is the data that we want to work with, and then after that we can say dot prepend to, and then you can say which element you want to add this to. So let's add this HTML to an element that has an ID of my notes. Because in an earlier lesson, that's the ID that we gave to the parent unordered list. All right, and if we want to animate this new content into view gradually, instead of just having it appear immediately, what we can do is say hide it to begin with, and then right after that, chain on slide down. And be sure to include a semicolon at the end of this line. Okay, and with all of this in place, let's go ahead and save this file. And then back on the front end, let's test it out. So for the title, I will say front end test. For the body text, just say lorem ipsum. And let's click create note. Cool, so we see that imagine real data slid down. And our script also cleared out these fields, so we are free to create a new one. Another new post. Hello world. Perfect. Except we don't actually want it to say imagine real data here. We want it to use the same format as the other note posts, right? With a large title headline and edit and delete buttons. However, before we get to that, I want to address something even more important, which is if we manually refresh the page, those two new posts that we created are completely gone, or at least it seems that way from the front end. But trust me, those posts exist. We can prove it by jumping into the admin dashboard, and if I click notes in the sidebar, here we see those two posts that we created from the front end, but you'll notice that they both say draft. Draft is the default post status when you create a post through the REST API, but draft posts do not show up in a typical query for posts. So for example, if I go into this front end test post, and then over in the right hand column, if instead of clicking save draft, I actually click publish, well, that's going to sort of finalize the post. Right now, its status is published instead of draft. So now, back on the front end, if I refresh, we do indeed see that new front end test post. Now, obviously, we don't want to have to go into the admin dashboard and manually adjust each post that's getting created. So what is a programmatic way of doing that? Well, back in our JavaScript, within our create note method, within this our new post object where we've set title and content, let's just set a third property. So include a comma at the end of this line. And let's create a new property named status. Well, by default, it has a value of draft. But instead, you and I can set it to publish. Now, in a future lesson, we are actually going to make all of the note posts private. Not only because I think that fits the nature of a note, but also for security reasons. So eventually we will be setting this to private. Let's not worry about that for now. For now, let's just set it to publish, status publish. Okay, if we save that. Now, if we take our front end for another test drive and say testing once again, this is a super amazing note, and click create. So we still need to update imagine real data here that gets added on the fly, but if we refresh the page, cool, there we see our brand new testing once again post. Now at this point, let's change gears and focus on that imagine real data here text, right? So if I create another sample post, hi, hey, hello, and go ahead and create. Let's adjust things so that this content that gets added to the page in real time on the fly perfectly matches the formatting for the other note posts. And that's exactly what we're going to cover in part 2 of this lesson. So let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.